You're standing in a hotel bar in Geneva. Smoke hangs thick in the air. Jazz hums from a record player that's just slightly out of tune. You're wearing a pressed suit, and you're smiling, not because you're happy, but because you've spent the last 6 months memorizing exactly how this version of you is supposed to smile. Across the room, a man flicks a gold lighter. The flame catches the end of a cigarette, but he's not here for the smoke. That lighter, polished, ornate, seemingly innocent, is a signal. 3 flicks, pause, 2 more. It's nothing to a casual observer, but to you, it's a message. The package is compromised. Get out, now. The man doesn't look up. He turns, calmly exits, and disappears into the crowd outside. You feel the heat rise in your chest, but your face stays perfectly still. Years of training kick in. You leave a folded napkin on the bar. Your exit cue, and slip through the back door. That's the last time you see him. The man with the lighter. 3 days later, his name is scrubbed from records. His apartment is empty. The newspapers say he returned to Moscow for health reasons. But you know better. Welcome to the real life of a Cold War spy, where a cigarette can end a career, a smile can be a lie, and survival depends on noticing things no one else even sees. But that moment in the bar? That was just the tip of it. To understand the world behind it, the fear, the games, the betrayals, we have to start at the very beginning. Because no one is born a spy. You're made. Carefully, relentlessly, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. But once you're in, there's no way out. And how that starts, that's what we're getting into next. You don't apply to be a Cold War spy like you apply for a desk job. There's no listing, no form, no friendly recruiter in a blazer. Instead, it starts with a whisper, a quiet invitation over coffee, a curious professor who sees something in you, a government agent who pulls you aside after a lecture, or a strange man at a party who seems a little too interested in your travel habits. Sometimes it starts even earlier, a childhood marked by languages, discipline, and distance. Your parents moved a lot. Your father worked for the government. You learned not to ask questions. You got used to secrets, which made you perfect for the business of keeping them. Whether you were in Washington, Moscow, Berlin, or Warsaw, Cold War spycraft began with a different kind of war, one that happened inside people. Because before you could lie to governments or steal files or seduce informants, you had to lie to yourself. Every day, with precision. The double life wasn't just a feature. It was the job. By day, you might be an attach, a translator, a businessman, or a journalist. Someone boring, someone forgettable. You went to meetings. You drank coffee. You filled out forms. By night, you passed microfilm through dead drops, eavesdropped on embassy receptions, or transmitted coded bursts of Morse from a fake wall in your apartment. Every conversation had 2 meanings. Every friend could be a spy. Every smile might hide a recorder. You didn't just fake names, you faked hobbies, faked memories, faked reactions. If someone mentions a place you've never been, but your alias says you have, you better have a story ready. What's the cafe on the corner? What time does the sun set in winter? Did the tram run on Sundays? Because one slip, even a small one, meant someone might start asking questions. And if they started asking questions, you might stop breathing. But even worse than being found out by the enemy was being found out by your own side. Because trust was just another mask. If your handlers thought you were getting soft, or worse, thinking for yourself, you might end up black-bagged and flown out under sedation, or quietly reassigned to a basement desk until your usefulness evaporated. And yet, for all the danger, the double life had a strange appeal. You lived in constant fear, but also in constant intensity. No moment was neutral. No word was wasted. Even walking down the street felt cinematic. You were always watching, always decoding, Always two people at once, and sometimes more. But to live that way, something had to happen first. You had to be transformed, rewired, prepared for a life of lies. That process? Spy school. And it was nothing like the movies. There's a reason they don't call it spy school. That sounds too polite, too safe. What you enter is more like a forge. It doesn't educate you. It reshapes you. Sometimes it breaks you. And that's on purpose. Whether you re-walking into a CIA training facility in Virginia or being bused to a secret KGB complex outside Moscow, the rules are the same. Trust nothing. Feel nothing. Reveal nothing. From the second you arrive, you're being watched, and not just by instructors. Everyone around you is a test. Even your roommates. Maybe especially your roommates. You don't get a syllabus. You don't get a name. What you get are scenarios. Exhaustion, isolation, and repetition. You're taught to kill, sure, but not like in action movies. No leaping karate kicks or flashy flips. Instead, it's close-range knife work, pressure point strikes, and how to silence a struggling body in under 4 seconds. You're taught to shoot, but only after you've crawled a mile in the rain, blindfolded, while being screamed at in multiple languages. You learn how to lie without blinking. How to tell the truth just enough to make a lie believable. You sit in an empty room across from a man whose job is to break you psychologically. He tells you your mother died, that your cover's blown, that your friend ratted you out. He watches your pupils dilate, your pulse rise, your lip twitch, and makes a note. He's not cruel, just clinical. You re a subject in a long experiment. Can you stop being a person and become a function? They teach you how to disappear in a crowd, how to hide microdots in fake lipstick tubes, how to seduce someone without falling for them, and how to die convincingly, or at least pretend to. One exercise involves fake arrest. Another forces you to write letters to your family, apologizing for what they'll never know you did. Some trainees cry. Others laugh. Most say nothing at all. Silence is the only safe reaction. You memorize cover stories until they replace your real memories. You answer to a fake name so long you start dreaming under it. One trainee in Moscow, real name unknown, forgot his legal identity entirely and had to be pulled from the program. He kept introducing himself at bars using his KGB coding name, even off duty. There are no weekends, no breaks, no windows. You learn to wake up alert and go to sleep unsure whether you'll be abducted in the night for a stress test. One day you're told you passed. The next, you redropped in a foreign city with no money. And one task, survive for 48 hours and make contact with a handler using a phrase only you should know. You're taught that fear isn't the enemy. Hesitation is. That the mission matters more than the people. That a clean exit is more important than a clean conscience. By the end of the program, you are unrecognizable, not just to your family or your old friends, to yourself. And that's the point. Because the next part of your life, the real part, one to be lived as you. It'll be lived as someone else. And the first time you make contact with that other world, the moment you pass information without ever making eye contact, that is when you will understand why the training was so brutal. But before you can handle a mission, you need to know how to pass secrets without getting caught. And for that, you need to master one of the oldest tricks in the book, the dead drop. You walk past a trash can on a foggy morning. Doesn't look like much, just a battered bin on the corner of an empty park trail. But your heartbeat's already up, because you know what's under the lid isn't garbage, it's intelligence. More specifically, it's a dead drop, one of the simplest, most ancient, and most dangerous tricks in the spy world. Dead drops were the heartbeat of Cold War spycraft. No high-speed chases, no rooftop escapes, just mundane objects hiding extraordinary secrets. It could be a hollowed-out rock on the side of the road, a loose brick in a wall, a pack of cigarettes taped beneath a bench. Sometimes, even a crushed soda can place just so at the edge of a curb. These weren't props. They were communication. Contactless, wordless, silent, safe in theory. Here's how it worked. You'd scout the drop site ahead of time, memorize it, visit it during the day, casually. Maybe walk a dog past it. Maybe eat a sandwich nearby. You'd need to make it yours, not too often, not too rarely. Just enough that nobody would notice you taking a second glance at that tree with the odd knot in the trunk. When it was time to use it, you'd slip out alone. No phone, no identifying documents, no metal, just the item, microfilm, a coded message, a map, maybe even cash, packed in a waterproof capsule, small enough to hide in a pencil case, strong enough to survive a rainstorm. You'd leave it fast, no lingering, and you never, ever looked back. The pickup might happen hours later, days even. The other agent would walk past, wearing a signal, a specific color scarf, a folded newspaper under the arm, an umbrella on a sunny day. Just like the dropper, they'd make it look casual, unremarkable, routine. But every part of it was choreographed. Times, angles, eye lines, even escape routes. If something went wrong, both sides knew to abort and disappear. Because if you were caught at a drop site, the enemy wouldn't care if you were just the messenger. They'd assume you knew everything, and you'd be treated accordingly. Still, dead drops weren't foolproof. Surveillance teams would sometimes stake out known locations, use infrared to detect disturbed Earth, sweep for fingerprints. Worse, some drops were compromised on purpose, left out in the open to lure in double agents. If you touched the wrong envelope, your own side might start asking why you were there at all. Which meant the dead drop wasn't just a tool, it was a test of your training, your nerves, your loyalty. And they weren't just used by professionals. In East Berlin, teenage informants were taught how to use trash drops to spy on their neighbors. In Washington, suburban housewives working for the KGB would leave laundry baskets on the porch at just the right angle to signal a meeting. There was no such thing as too ordinary. In fact, the more boring the drop, the better it worked. But dead drops were only one part of the equation. Getting the intel out was step one. Step two was making sure you didn't get caught doing it. That's where spy gear came in. The gadgets, the tech, the stuff that sounds like fiction, but wasn't. And some of it, it was as bizarre as it was deadly. You're looking at a tube of lipstick, crimson red, gold cap, a bit worn around the edges. Looks ordinary, feels ordinary. But press the base just right, and it fires a single bullet, silent, lethal, and untraceable. This isn't fantasy. This is Cold War gear. Both sides of the Iron Curtain had entire divisions dedicated to gadgetry, tools designed to deceive, disguise, and sometimes destroy. These weren't comic book inventions. They were real, built by engineers, chemists, tailors, even magicians. Yes, actual stage magicians were consulted, because misdirection wasn't just for the theater anymore. Let's start with the classics. The CIA Insectophopter, a dragonfly-shaped drone designed to deliver audio surveillance equipment. It was the size of a paperclip. Its wings fluttered. It could hover near open windows. It worked, sort of. The wind made it hard to control, and it never got mass deployment. But it proved a point. Spies would try anything. Then there were the cameras. You've probably seen spy films with miniature cameras hidden in pens or belt buckles. But the real versions were more creative. Cigarette packs that took 35mm shots, tie clips with tiny lenses, even hollowed-out coat buttons that doubled as film storage. Some cameras were built into gloves, activated by bending a finger. Others were triggered by body heat or motion. KGB agents had hollow coins that snapped open to reveal microfilm. The CIA jettered, with matchbooks that held flash drives decades before flash drives existed. Audio bugs were hidden in everything from light sockets to shoes. And when the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was gifted a carved wooden seal of the United States, proudly mounted in a diplomat's office, it took 7 years before anyone realized it contained a bug. No wires, no battery, just pure brilliance, powered by invisible radio waves beamed from outside the building. But not every gadget was clever. Some were just crude. Cyanide pills, or L-pills, as they were sometimes called, were coated capsules hidden in fountain pen barrels or false teeth. If you got caught and needed to avoid interrogation, one bite and it was over. Quick, painless. Supposedly. The West, German intelligence service, once tried deploying pigeons with miniature cameras strapped to their chests. In theory, they'd fly over enemy bases and snap shots mid-air. In reality, the birds got lost. Frequently. And the pictures were mostly blurry roofs and the occasional tree. More successful were disguise kits. MI6 developed full facial prosthetics, latex masks, fake mustaches, contact lenses that altered eye color. The CIA took it further with jack-in-the-box decoys, inflatable. Mannequins used to fool enemy surveillance during quick car swaps. An agent would slip out of the moving vehicle, the dummy would pop up in their place, and the car would keep driving with a passenger that wasn't breathing. But the gadgets alone didn't make the spy. You had to know when and how to use them. A lipstick gun in your purse might buy you one desperate moment. A dead-drop radio transmitter might give you a chance to vanish. But none of it meant anything if you couldn't keep your story straight, because the real weapon wasn't a gadget. It was your relationship with the person across the table. That's where the real games were played. Not with bullets or bombs, but with trust, or the illusion of it. And to see how that worked, you need to understand one of the Cold War's most intimate and dangerous dynamics, the handler and the asset. You're in a hotel lobby in Prague. The carpet smells like damp tobacco. The front desk clerk pretends not to notice the same man walking in every Tuesday at 9:03 p.m. You sit down on a couch that's too low, open a newspaper you don't care about, and wait. He arrives 2 minutes later. No eye contact. Just sits beside you and says, "Weather's worse than last week." That's the signal. You reply, "Forecast says it clears by morning." Another signal. The meeting begins. But this isn't a friend. This isn't a boss. This is your handler. And you're the asset. That means you do the dangerous work. You pass the intel. You take the risks. Your handler? He manages you, controls you, maybe even owns you. In spycraft, the handler-asset relationship is the most intimate, most manipulative bond there is. It's not built on loyalty. Not really. It's built on leverage. Secrets, money, ego, desperation, sometimes love, often fear. You might be a disillusioned diplomat feeding scraps of information for cash. You might be a scientist caught in an affair, blackmailed into leaking weapons data. Or a true believer, thinking you re-saving the world from tyranny, even if it means betraying everything you've ever known. Your handler knows all of this. He studies your weaknesses, your wants, your fears. If you're scared of being alone, he makes you feel seen. If you crave adventure, he calls you brave. If you need money, he offers just enough to get you hooked, but never enough to let you walk away. And he never reveals everything. He doesn't tell you who else he's running. He doesn't tell you what your intel is really used for. He keeps the leash short and the praise just long enough to make you return. There are rules. You never meet in the same place twice. You don't use real names. You use verbal codes, gesture-based signals, and sometimes fake families. Meet the wife, kiss the child, take a stroll through the park as if nothing's wrong. But everything is wrong. You just can't let it show. Sometimes the relationship starts professional and turns personal. That's the most dangerous kind, because when emotions get tangled with orders, the lines blur. Some assets fall for their handlers. Some handlers return the feeling. Others pretend to, because sometimes pretending to love someone is the easiest way to make them give you everything. But if an asset starts to get suspicious or scared or sloppy, the handler makes a call. A quiet one. And the next time they meet, there's no newspaper, no code phrase, just an empty seat. Or worse, a car crash, a disappearance, a funeral no one attends. Still, many assets stay in the game for years. Not because they're forced to, but because they need it. The thrill, the purpose, the feeling that they matter, that they know something no one else does, that they belong to something bigger than themselves, even if that something is dark, silent, and doesn't know their real name. Because sometimes the handler is the only person who ever really sees them, even if he's just using them. But what happens when the mask starts to slip? When you've played your alias so long, you can't remember who you were before. To survive that, you'd have to become your cover completely. And for Cold War spies, that meant building not just a lie, but an entire life. You stare into a mirror in a bathroom you don't recognize. The face is familiar. The name isn't. That name belongs to your alias, your cover. It has a birthday, a passport, school records, photos, a favorite bar, an apartment with bills in its name. To anyone else, it's a real person. But to you, it's a costume. One you've worn so long that you don't just answer to it. You dream in it. This is life as a Cold War spy. You don't just play a role, you live it. Creating a cover wasn't as simple as picking a name and running with it. A good cover was layered, believable, and anchored in 1,000 tiny details. John Martin, freelance travel photographer from Toronto, doesn't work unless John has a real portfolio, a bank account that tracks international movement, and a stack of vacation postcards from cities he's never actually been to. And if someone digs deeper, they'll find rental agreements, signed leases, hotel check-ins, dry cleaning tags, even fake tax returns. All crafted to match a life you never lived, but one you expected to recall down to the color of the neighbor's front door. For the CIA and MI6, building those fake identities, called legends, was an art form. You'd spend months, sometimes years, developing the persona. You'd learn its history, internalize its speech patterns, build muscle memory so deep that when someone shouts your cover name across a street, you turn without thinking. For the KGB, legends were even more extreme. They didn't just create aliases. They built illegals, deep cover agents who slipped into Western countries with entirely fabricated backstories, sometimes posing as locals for decades. They'd marry, have kids, work jobs, and all the while, their real names were never spoken aloud, even to their own families. There's a famous case. 2 KGB operatives who lived in Canada under assumed identities for over 20 years. They hosted backyard barbecues, paid taxes, sent their kids to local schools. They were beloved by neighbors. No one had the slightest clue. Not until the wall fell and old files began to leak did the truth come out. Even their children didn't know. But living inside a fake life comes at a cost. You start to blur. When someone asks about your hometown, you hesitate, not because you don't know, but because you now have to. When your cover has a sister, you invent stories about her, what she liked, how she laughed, and you start to believe them. Because it's safer to live the lie than risk revealing the truth. Some spies folded under that weight. One CIA operative reportedly checked himself into a hospital after forgetting his own real birthday. Others became so entrenched in their legend that they refused to leave when the mission ended. They liked the new life better. But your cover doesn't just protect you from the enemy. It protects the mission from you. If you're captured, tortured, interrogated, drugged, all they'll get is the fake story, the name that isn't yours, the memories that were planted. And if you do your job right, they won't even know you were a spy to begin with. But no matter how deep the cover, no matter how tight the story, there's one thing you can never fully hide from: surveillance. Because out there, someone's always watching. And sometimes, that someone knows exactly what to look for. You walk into your apartment and immediately know something's off. Maybe the rug is slightly out of place. Maybe the blinds are drawn differently. Maybe there's a faint smell of bleach. Aftershave? Doesn't matter. You don't touch anything. You don't even shut the door behind you. You've been made. If you were a Western spy operating in the East, especially in Moscow or East Berlin, this wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a guarantee. Every phone call you made, every step you took, every conversation whispered in what you thought was privacy, it was all monitored. The surveillance wasn't sloppy. It was surgical. Let's start with the KGB. These weren't just paranoid watchers. They were professionals, backed by an enormous bureaucracy. By the 1980s, the KGB had hundreds of thousands of officers, informants, and technicians, many of them assigned solely to monitoring foreign operatives. Enter a hotel, and your room would be bugged. Leave a briefcase unattended, and it would be searched, photographed, and returned, all without a scratch. Even your toothbrush might be swabbed for evidence of stress chemicals. Your meals were catalogued, your drinks sometimes tampered with. If you bought a book from a shop, that information was logged and analyzed. In East Germany, the Stasi, the KGB's ideological cousin, took surveillance to surreal heights. They had whole floors of buildings dedicated to opening mail, steaming it open, photographing it, resealing it, and sending it on its way. They collected smells, yes, smells, storing scent samples from citizens and suspects alike so that trained dogs could track them later. But it wasn't just gadgets and dogs. It was people, neighbors, colleagues, even family. The Stasi had over 180,000 unofficial collaborators, regular citizens who reported on each other. Imagine wondering if your best friend is writing down everything you say, or your own child. And Western intelligence wasn't innocent either. The CIA had eyes in airports, ears in consulates, and photographers in balconies across Berlin. They hired locals to tail suspected double agents. They paid janitors to collect trash from embassies. They used lasers to read sound vibrations from windows. Yes, sound through glass, allowing them to eavesdrop from across the street. Surveillance became so embedded in daily life that spies developed routines just to detect it. You might take a surveillance detection route, a path filled with tight corners, sudden turns, mirrored shop windows. If you passed the same person 3 times, game over. You've been followed. And once you knew, you had 2 options. Drop the mission or play dumb and run it anyway, at twice the risk. But sometimes, you wouldn't know. That's the horror of surveillance in the Cold War. You might live under a microscope and never realize how closely you were being watched until it was too late. A random knock, a missed appointment, a cold stare from someone you trusted. That's all it took. Even when you returned to your safe house, the one place that was supposed to feel secure, you couldn't exhale, because you never knew if someone had planted a listening device in your lamp, or if your briefcase had been opened just enough to leave a fingerprint. Paranoia wasn't a symptom. It was a skill. And if you cracked under the pressure, if you made even one mistake while being watched, the fallout could be life-ending. Because behind the Iron Curtain, the penalty for espionage wasn't a slap on the wrist. It wasn't even always a trial. Sometimes it was a black van. And what happened inside that van? That's where things took a darker turn. The kind of turn we're about to explore next. The black van pulls up without sirens. No shouting. No uniforms. Just a quiet engine and two men in plain clothes who step out and light cigarettes. They're not in a hurry. They don't need to be, because they already know where you'll be in exactly 4 minutes. You follow the same route every Wednesday. And just like that, you're gone. If you were a spy caught on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, your fate was rarely public. In East Berlin, Prague, or Minsk, you might be arrested without warning, interrogated without counsel, and held without charge. Your embassy might not even know you'd vanished, at least not right away. Sometimes not ever. This wasn't the spy fantasy of martinis and poker games. This was the other side of Cold War espionage, the part where the walls really were listening and they didn't like what they heard. In the Eastern Bloc, once you were taken, the first stop wasn't usually a courtroom. It was a basement. Fluorescent lighting. No clocks, no windows. The Stasi used psychological pressure more often than physical violence, at least at first. They wanted you disoriented, isolated. You'd be kept in total silence or bombarded with relentless noise. Interrogations came at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes every 2 hours. And Western spies weren't immune. A captured CIA operative might be traded in a prisoner exchange or not. If you weren't high value, you were expendable. A rumor, a whisper, or a single misstep could cost you your life. But ironically, it was often Eastern Bloc citizens who had it worse. Locals who cooperated with Western agents, the ones who passed notes, translated documents, or just said too much at a bar, were branded traitors. And the punishment for treason in most of the Soviet sphere was as brutal as it was quiet. Sometimes it was a trial. Sometimes it was a sentence. Sometimes it was just a knock on the door at 2A, followed by silence. There's a chilling consistency in the stories of those who survived it. They don't describe torture as pain. They describe it as certainty, the moment they knew no one was coming. That no code word would save them. That the cover identity they lived and breathed every day would now become their tombstone. And yet, people kept doing it. People kept spying. They kept running missions, planting bugs, slipping notes through hidden panels, and relaying coded messages through shoe heels. Why? Because they believed it mattered. They believed what they were doing could change something, stop something, win something, even if they didn't live to see it. But sometimes the most dangerous thing a spy could do was try to leave, because crossing over to the other side, defecting, was the highest stakes gamble in the game. And the odds? Not good. Imagine standing in line at a border checkpoint, a briefcase in one hand, a forged passport in the other. You're surrounded by armed guards. Your heart isn't pounding. It's silent, frozen, because if even one letter on that passport looks wrong, you're not just going to be detained. You're going to disappear. This is defection. In the Cold War, defecting, switching sides, wasn't just a political move. It was an existential one. It meant burning your past to the ground. Your country, your family, your name, gone in a flash. And it meant gambling that the people you were running to wouldn't to decide later that you were more valuable as a corpse than a source. Some defectors were high-level officers, KGB agents with years of intel, CIA officers who'd had enough. Others were military, scientists, linguists, cryptographers, even dancers or athletes with secrets sewn into their suitcases. But no matter the rank, the process was always the same. Trust no one, say nothing. move fast. And even then, it often went wrong. Take the case of Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who passed secrets to the West in the early 1960s. He revealed Soviet missile capabilities, helped the U.S. decode military structures, and played a critical role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But his defection wasn't clean. He was caught, tried in secret, and, depending on who you ask, either executed or off-D himself with cyanide to avoid what came next. Or consider Anatoly Golitsyn, another KGB officer who defected to the U.S. in 1961. He brought with him a suitcase of paranoia, claiming dozens of high-level Western agents were actually Soviet moles. Some believed him. Others thought he was planting disinformation. The CIA itself fractured over it. One defector nearly shattered the agency from the inside. On the Western side, defectors to the East were treated with suspicion, even by those who welcomed them. They might be paraded in front of cameras, used for propaganda, given a new apartment, a car, and a pension. But behind the scenes, constant surveillance, constant testing. Were they truly loyal, or were they bait? One infamous American defector to the USSR, Lee Harvey Oswald, offered military secrets, asked for Soviet citizenship, and later returned to the U.S. under murky circumstances. His story ended in Dallas, 1963, but the details of his time in Russia were made a fog of contradictions. And defectors weren't just at risk from the people they left behind. They were at risk from their own new handlers. If your intel dried up, if your usefulness faded, so did the protection. Some were quietly reassigned to dead-end jobs. Others just vanished. Natural causes, the files said. A bad heart, a car crash, an accidental fall from a fifth-story window. For some defectors, the moment they crossed the border was the last time they ever saw peace. They lived in safe houses, slept with pistols, changed addresses monthly. They were ghosts in systems that had no use for them anymore, too dangerous to release, too inconvenient to keep. And yet, even with the fear and betrayal, defection still had a magnetic pull. For spies drowning in guilt or ideology, it offered something rare, a reset button, a chance to start over. Or at least, that's how it looked from across the wire. But reset buttons have a cost. Because you didn't just leave your country behind when you defected, you left everything, including the people you loved. And in the world of espionage, love was a liability. And sometimes, it was the deadliest weapon of all. You fall in love at a train station, or so you think. She brushes past you, drops a notebook. You pick it up. Hands touch. Eyes meet. She smiles. You meet again the next week. Then the next. Eventually, it feels like fate. But in the Cold War, love was rarely fate. It was a file. Planned, reviewed, approved, maybe even assigned. The use of romantic relationships in espionage was so common, so calculated, that it had its own term, honey trapping. Both sides did it. Male and female agents were trained to seduce targets, build trust, and extract secrets, slowly, patiently, devastatingly. You weren't always told you were being played. That was the point. Some targets died believing their relationships were real. Others figured it out too late, when a private bedroom conversation showed up in a government report, or when the person they loved vanished without a trace, right after they'd handed over a crucial piece of intel. It wasn't just the enemy who ran these traps. Sometimes your own agency would encourage, or quietly require, you to maintain romantic ties with a source, not for loyalty, for leverage. Because when someone loves you, they'll do things they wouldn't do for money. And sometimes, they'll do them even when they know it's wrong. Imagine living with someone for 5 years, sharing meals, memories, secrets, then learning it was all surveillance. That every time they kissed you, they were writing a report about what you said afterward. Some spies turned violent when they found out. Others just shut down. One American agent described the realization as a death that never ends. But the psychological toll didn't just hit the targets. The spies who posed as lovers, they often paid a price too. You're trained to fake intimacy, to imitate empathy. But after years of pretending, the line between performance and reality gets thin. Some agents really did fall in love with their targets. And that was a problem. Because love makes you honest. It makes you hesitate. And in the spy game, hesitation could be fatal. There are stories, mostly hidden, some half confirmed, of agents who chose love over loyalty, who ran off with their targets, who tried to protect them, lied to their handlers, even defect together. These stories usually end badly, not with arrests, with disappearances. But even when agents didn't fall in love, they often had to simulate it with disturbing accuracy. The KGB had manuals on how to maintain convincing long-term relationships. The CIA trained agents in body language, emotional manipulation, even sexual technique. There were entire operations where spies married their marks, had children, built lives, all for access. And sometimes the deception wasn't limited to outsiders. Two spies might marry under orders. A match made not in heaven, but in Langley or Lubyanka. They'd lived together, raised children, all while knowing that the foundation of their marriage was strategic, not emotional. Some made it work. Others crumbled under the weight of pretense. Because when you go home to someone who knows you're lying, and lies just as well, trust becomes impossible. And that mistrust wasn't just personal. It was professional. Because for every agent working a romance, there was always a question. Are they working me too? In the Cold War, love wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, a weapon, a mask. And behind every kiss, there could be a camera. But for all the pain of personal betrayal, the biggest shocks came from inside the agencies themselves, from the so-called loyal operatives who were, in fact, playing for the other side. These were the moles. And their impact? Devastating. You sit in a high-security conference room, debriefing an operation that went sideways. Files were leaked. Identities blown. A key asset vanished. But the strange part? There was no breach. No intercepted messages. No surveillance failure. The only explanation is unthinkable. There's a mole. Moles, double agents embedded inside your own intelligence agency, weren't just dangerous. They were catastrophic. One mole could unravel entire networks, get people imprisoned or worse, and destroy years of intelligence work in a single report. And during the Cold War, they were everywhere. Take Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who sold secrets to the KGB for nearly a decade. He wasn't some hyper-intelligent mastermind. He was bitter, broke, and overlooked. But that was enough. He handed over the names of dozens of U.S. assets working in the Soviet Union. Many of those people were arrested. Some were executed. The losses were so sweeping that for years, the CIA assumed they'd been hacked. They hadn't. Ames had just walked into the Soviet embassy one day and offered his services. Or Robert Hansen, an FBI agent who spied for the Soviets for over 20 years, right under the noses of his colleagues. He compromised nuclear war plans, surveillance strategies, and even the identities of double agents. His betrayal was so deep, his files so sensitive, that when he was finally caught in 2001, long after the Cold War ended, officials called it one of the most damaging espionage cases in U.S. history. But it wasn't just the Americans. The British were infiltrated too. Kim Philby, a high-ranking member of British intelligence, was also working for the KGB. He wasn't some minor officer. He was at the top. Friends with future prime ministers. Trusted by the CIA, he attended parties with American handlers, shook hands with generals, and all the while funneled critical information straight to Moscow. When he was finally unmasked, he didn't go quietly. He fled to the Soviet Union, where he lived the rest of his life in a haze of vodka, guilt, and bitter nostalgia. He later admitted he missed England, even while believing he had done the right thing. But here's the terrifying part. No agency ever really knows how many moles they had. Even today, decades later, former intelligence officials admit there are operations they still don't fully understand. Was it just bad luck? Or was someone feeding the other side? Because that's the horror of moles. They're invisible. They work beside you. They make jokes, ring donuts. They're on your team, in your files, sometimes even in your office. And every time you run a mission, they're right there, watching it crumble. The fear of moles was so intense that agencies began turning on themselves. Polygraph tests, financial audits, random reassignment, relationships monitored. Entire careers destroyed by whispers. If you showed up to work wearing a slightly nicer suit than usual, someone might flag that. If your reports were too clean, suspicious. Trust collapsed. Some departments stopped sharing intel entirely. Some agents walked away from decades of service, unable to stomach the idea that the person in the next cubicle might be the reason their contacts in Prague had disappeared. And once a mole was caught, there was still the aftermath. Every case they touched had to be reviewed. Every name, every date, every detail, rechecked. The damage never stopped at just one mission. It echoed across borders, years, and lives. Even worse, sometimes a mole wasn't a traitor for ideology, or money, or power. Sometimes they were just bored, underpaid, lonely, or in love with someone who asked the wrong question at the right time. And if that sounds terrifying, that a global intelligence war could be swung by something as small as loneliness, just wait until you see what happens when the systems fail completely. Because the worst stories of Cold War espionage aren't the betrayals by enemies, but the disasters caused by friends. It starts with a phone that doesn't ring. An agent doesn't show up at a checkpoint. A radio burst transmission is missed. A handler paces his hotel room, checking the door every 5 minutes. And just like that, the thread snaps. In Cold War spycraft, you could do everything right, follow protocol, stay in character, use the right codes, and still watch it all unravel in seconds. Because when things went wrong, they didn't just go wrong. They exploded. Some of the worst espionage disasters weren't the result of betrayal. They were accidents, miscommunications, slips, the tiniest of errors that cascaded into full-blown meltdowns. Take Operation Gold, for instance. In the 1950s, the CIA British intelligence dug a tunnel under East Berlin, hundreds of meters long, to tap into Soviet telephone lines. For almost a year, they intercepted thousands of classified conversations. It was a triumph, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that the KGB had been tipped off from the beginning. Kim Philby, the British mole, had told them everything. The Soviets let the tunnel stay active just long enough to feed disinformation. Then, when it suited them, they discovered it in a dramatic public bust. The West had been listening, but only to lies. Or the farewell dossier, when a Soviet engineer handed the West a list of hundreds of KGB spies posing as diplomats and businessmen around the world. It was a treasure trove of intelligence. But the way it was handled led to suspicion inside the CIA itself. The agency's leadership started turning on each other. Careers were destroyed. Trust fractured. And some believe it led to even more double agents being planted later in retaliation. And then there were the cases that should have been routine. A courier leaves a briefcase in a taxi. A dead drop is mistimed. An agent picks up a hollow coin with the wrong hand and drops it in full view of a patrol officer. Not dramatic. Not cinematic, just human. But in espionage, human is the most dangerous variable. There's the story of a KGB officer who defected, only to be outed by a careless American journalist who leaked his name in a magazine article. He was later found in a hotel room under unexplained circumstances. No one believed it was an accident. Or the MI6 agent, whose coded messages were intercepted because he didn't change his cipher key frequently enough. A whole network collapsed. People vanished. Even something as small as a cough could be catastrophic. In one operation, a tapped telephone line was rendered useless because the informant had a chronic throat condition. A constant coughing masked every usable word. Years of prep, ruined by allergies. But perhaps the most chilling failures were the ones no one noticed at the time. Because sometimes the mission succeeded. The intel got through. The agent escaped. The drop was made. But the information was wrong. A misheard phrase. A mistranslated document. A misread signal. It didn't just confuse one agency. It altered policy. Created paranoia. Drove decisions. Missed chances for peace. Escalated near conflicts into full-blown standoffs. And the agents? They rarely knew. They went home thinking they'd done their job. But behind closed doors, generals argued over their mistakes. Presidents rewrote speeches. Missiles were moved. That's the dirty secret of Cold War espionage. It wasn't precise. It wasn't clean. It was 1,000 moving parts operated by flawed people under impossible pressure, which meant sometimes success and failure looked exactly the same. But what about after the dust settled? After the operation was done, the files were closed, and the code names retired? What happened to the spies who made it out? The answer isn't glamorous. It's often not even safe. Because for many Cold War operatives, the hardest part wasn't the mission. It was what came next. You wake up in a new apartment. The lights buzz softly. The furniture is plain, anonymous. There's no mail, no photographs, no name on the door. This is your reward for surviving the Cold War. Because once the mission ends, once the wall falls, the files are shredded, the names scrubbed. You don't go back to normal life. There is no normal life. For some spies, retirement meant vanishing, literally. Relocated under new identities to new countries, often with fake resumes and state-issued backstories. You might be placed in a quiet suburb, given a small stipend, told to blend in. Smile. Pretend you used to be a teacher or an accountant. Never mention what you really did, even to your neighbors, even to your kids. For others, it meant re-entry into society with scars no one could see. Some ex-operatives wrote memoirs, worked as consultants, or trained the next generation. But most didn't talk, because the fear never really went away. Who else was still out there? Who still had the old lists? Who remembered? Even defectors who were promised protection sometimes found that protection conditional. They might be quietly dropped when they were no longer useful. Watched, abandoned, or worse, handed back in covert prisoner swaps decades after the public had forgotten them. And for the ones who stayed loyal, who gave everything to their agency, their mission, their cause, the end of the Cold War didn't feel like victory. It felt like erasure. Many operatives found that the world they'd sacrificed everything for had moved on without them. The files they risked their lives to secure were now declassified. The governments they served were now shaking hands with former enemies. And their names? Nowhere. Not even in the footnotes. Some developed deep resentment. A few even turned to crime, selling their expertise or their remaining secrets to the highest bidder. One KGB defector in the 90s was caught running a black market passport ring in Madrid. A former CIA asset ended up consulting for private security firms in places the agency wouldn't touch. Others simply broke down. Because the real damage of Cold War spying wasn't just physical, it was psychological. After years of pretending, of holding in secrets, of living under layers of lies, it's hard to remember who you really are, if that person even still exists. Some develop severe paranoia, not the healthy kind they were trained to use, the kind that wrecks you. One retired operative would unscrew light bulbs before sleeping, convinced they were listening devices. Another refused to use modern technology, certain every call was tapped. Some turned to alcohol, to isolation. A few off themselves, quietly, no notes, because even in death, they couldn't break protocol. But the strangest thing? Many said they missed it. The danger, the clarity, the sense of purpose. Out there, in the field, you knew who you were, even if you were pretending. You had a mission, a code, a team, even if you couldn't name them. Civilian life felt hollow by comparison. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of a CIA officer who left the agency and tried to become a novelist. He wrote thrillers, based loosely on missions he couldn't legally describe. But he stopped after 2 books. He told a friend, "It's all fiction now." The real stuff was cleaner. Clean, but not peaceful. Because even if the Cold War ended on paper, the people who fought it silently, invisibly, carried it with them. In their habits, in their nightmares, in the way they walked into rooms and scanned every corner without realizing it. But they weren't the only ones haunted by the past. Because while some spies tried to forget their missions, others found themselves surrounded by reminders, especially the ones who had children. You're 6 years old. Your mom says not to answer the door unless she uses a special knock. Your dad never talks about work, but he comes home at midnight and always checks the windows. Twice. You think this is normal. Because when you grow up in a spy's house during the Cold War, reality is bent before you ever realize it. Children of spies didn't just live in the shadow of secrecy. They were raised inside it, and often without even knowing it. Some didn't find out what their parents really did until decades later. Others figured it out early, piecing together clues. The strange visitors, the hushed phone calls, the family trips that weren't vacations but cover assignments. For deep cover operatives, the illegals, deployed by the KGB in Western countries, their children were often born into fully fabricated lives. The parents had aliases, fake birth certificates, no relatives, no photographs, just backstories memorized so thoroughly they could tell bedtime stories based on them. Imagine being a teenager and discovering your real last name isn't the one on your school ID. Family dinners were watched by surveillance teams. Vacations were often rerouted. Your friend's parents might actually be following your dad. One child of a U.S. diplomat in Moscow recalled a time when she wasn't allowed to attend a birthday party, not because it was dangerous, but because her dad suspected the host was KGB and didn't want her accidentally revealing anything. For the children, the legacy of espionage didn't end with childhood. It shaped their worldview. Some grew up distrustful of institutions. Others joined the intelligence world themselves. A few wrote memoirs, trying to make sense of a life that was always half true. And then there were those who walked away completely, changed their names, cut ties, refused to speak about it. Because even if you weren't the one planting bugs or stealing documents, you lived the consequences. You felt the fear, the silence, the distance. But one thing is true across almost every story. Cold War spy families didn't feel like heroes. They didn't feel like villains either. They felt like ghosts, half visible, always moving, never certain which version of their life was real. And in some ways, that's what made the Cold War different from every other kind of conflict. It wasn't fought with armies. It was fought with people. Their relationships, their weaknesses, their secrets, and sometimes their bank accounts. Because for a surprising number of spies, ideology had nothing to do with it. They just needed money. He walks into the embassy like he's lost. Says he wants to talk. Says he has information. He's nervous, but not afraid. Because this isn't about politics. It's about his mortgage. This is the kind of spy no one wants to talk about. The kind who does it for cash. We like to imagine spies as ideologues. Patriots, traitors, zealots, radicals. People with missions. People with beliefs. But the truth? A lot of Cold War espionage came down to something simpler. Money. Especially in the East, where wages were controlled, economies were crumbling, and foreign luxuries were strictly rationed. Even a small bribe could sway someone to pass information. A Western radio, a pair of Levi's, a few thousand West German marks. These things had power. Not because people were greedy, but because they were desperate. And in the West, the temptation was often subtler, but just as effective. CIA agents who felt underpaid, analysts who resented being passed over for promotions, clerks who had gambling debts. It didn't take a mastermind recruiter to spot a target. It just took someone who was listening. The Soviets understood this well. The KGB had entire units devoted to spotting financial vulnerabilities. They'd watch agents leave casinos, follow them to loan offices, learn their spending habits. Then, at the right moment, they'd make an offer. Help us once, get paid, walk away. Of course, it was never just once. The Americans used similar tactics. In Czechoslovakia, a mechanic with access to military hardware specs was paid in Western currency, enough to move his family to a bigger apartment. He didn't even know what he was handing over. Just diagrams, numbers. But it was valuable, and he kept getting envelopes. Eventually, he disappeared. The money wasn't always large. In some cases, Eastern Bloc agents were recruited for the price of a plane ticket and a promise of asylum. Others were lured with shopping trips. A few hours in a Western department store was more persuasive than any ideology. Money. And then there were those who weren't even recruited. They volunteered. Known in spy jargon as walk-ins. These were people who simply showed up at embassies or military attach offices and offered their services. Some were sincere, some were traps. All of them were wild cards. One Soviet naval officer walked into the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, offering submarine deployment schedules in exchange for enough money to open a bar in Thailand. He got the money. He got the bar. Years later, when Russia was opening archives, his name appeared on a list of serious threats to naval stability. Sometimes, the money wasn't even for personal use. It was for medical care, to pay for a child's surgery, to support aging parents. A choice between loyalty to a flag and survival for your family. That wasn't a hard call for many. He was eventually caught in a sting operation. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "I felt underappreciated." That line appears more than you'd expect in Cold War spy archives. Underappreciated, overlooked, unrecognized. In other words, not loyal to the enemy, just disillusioned with their own side. But sometimes, the people who used money to recruit also used money to trap. Intelligence services would pay a new source, then use the payment as leverage. Now you're compromised. They'd say, "You're one of us." No turning back. It was a dirty trick, but it worked. Because once money entered the equation, guilt followed. And guilt was something every agency knew how to weaponize. But cash wasn't the only currency of the Cold War. The real prize, the thing both sides chased relentlessly, wasn't money at all. It was silence. Or rather, the ability to listen when no one knew you were there. Which meant the Cold War wasn't just fought on land. It was fought in the air. And far above your head, the most secret missions weren't carried out by people at all. They were carried out by machines. At 70,000 feet, the sky is pitch black. Below you, the curve of the earth stretches in silence. No borders, no politics. Just terrain, valleys, mountains, missile silos. You're not flying a commercial jet. You're flying a U-2 spy plane. And up here, there are no second chances. During the Cold War, the most valuable intelligence didn't come from whispers. It came from eyes. Not human ones, camera lenses. Satellite or airborne, it didn't matter. What mattered was what they saw, and whether you got the film home before someone shot you out of the sky. The U-2 was the crown jewel of American surveillance, designed to fly so high that enemy missiles couldn't reach it. At least, not in theory. It carried sophisticated cameras capable of snapping license plate-level images from the edge of space. From the late 1950s onward, the U-2 mapped out Soviet nuclear sites, submarine bases, and airfields. It revealed installations the Pentagon hadn't even dreamed of. The flights were dangerous, often solo, always tense. Pilots were trained not just in aviation, but in evasion, self-destruction, and if necessary, how to die without being captured. Because if you were shot down, there'd be no rescue. Just ask Francis Gary Powers. In 1960, Powers was flying a U-2 mission deep over the USSR when his plane was struck by a surface-to-air missile. He ejected, survived, and was promptly captured. The U.S. government claimed he was on a weather research mission, but the Soviets produced the wreckage. And the pilot? It was a massive embarrassment. The U.S. had to admit it had been conducting aerial surveillance. Powers spent nearly 2 years in Soviet prison before being swapped in a dramatic bridge exchange. One spy for another. He returned home, but his reputation was never the same. Some called him a coward for not using the self-destruct capsule. Others saw him as a survivor who'd done his duty. After that, the skies became a contested domain. Enter the SR-71 Blackbird, faster, sleeker, deadlier. Capable of Mach 3, that is over 2,200 miles per hour. It could outrun missiles rather than outfly them. It became a ghost above enemy skies. No one could catch it, not even the Soviets. But not all reconnaissance happened with humans at the controls. The Corona satellite program, run by the U.S., was the first successful attempt to photograph enemy territory from orbit. These satellites didn't beam images digitally. They dropped film canisters back into the atmosphere, which were caught mid-air by planes with giant nets. The Soviets had their own aerial programs. Aircraft like the Tupolev Tu-95 were used to buzz U.S. airspace, testing radar responses. Their satellites matched American efforts step for step. And when they couldn't reach the sky, they reached lower, developing balloon surveillance, and later, space-based infrared sensors. The air wasn't just a battlefield. It was a chessboard. Every time one side innovated, the other scrambled to catch up. If the U.S. launched a new aircraft, the USSR built new missiles. If the Soviets moved a base, American satellites adjusted their orbits. It was constant, relentless, and it wasn't just about photos. The skies also carried signals intelligence, or SIGINT. Giant flying antenna arrays listened to every transmission below. Code words, movement orders, emergency drills. These signals, picked up from hundreds of miles away, often told analysts more than any photograph ever could. Still, the risk remained. One wrong move in the air could mean a diplomatic crisis or worse. In 1983, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Air Flight 007, believing it was a U.S. spy plane. All 269 civilians aboard were killed. The world teetered on the edge of war for days. Misidentification in the sky could be fatal. But even as technology improved and satellites became sharper, the human element remained, because someone still had to interpret the images, understand the patterns, spot the one truck parked where it shouldn't be. And sometimes, a sharp-eyed analyst with a ruler and a light box could do what a billion-dollar satellite could not: predict a missile launch or prevent a war. And if the sky was dangerous, the sea was even worse. Because beneath the waves, the Cold War's quietest and most terrifying missions were unfolding. You're 300 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, surrounded by steel, steam, and silence. No sunlight, no windows, just the hum of machinery and the ever-present thought that, at any moment, the ocean could become your coffin. This is life aboard a Cold War submarine, where espionage didn't happen with trench coats and briefcases, but with sonar pings, coded bursts, and shadows in the deep. While spies above ground watched each other through binoculars and telescopes, down here, the surveillance was sonar. Every creak, every footstep, every mechanical noise could betray your position to an enemy listening thousands of miles away. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union knew this. The sea was the ultimate chessboard. It hid secrets better than any safe house. But it also demanded absolute control. Let's start with the ballistic missile submarines, floating doomsday machines nicknamed boomers. These were the crown jewels of nuclear deterrence. One American Ohio-class sub could carry 24 Trident missiles. Each missile could target multiple cities independently. That meant one sub, unseen and silent, had enough firepower to end a war before it even began. The Soviets had their own arsenal. Typhoon-class submarines, the largest ever built, massive steel beasts designed to patrol the Arctic under thick ice. And with them came the ever-present danger of shadowing. When one sub secretly followed another, waiting, listening, sometimes only a few hundred yards away. Shadowing was an art form, a deadly one. Submarines had to match speed and depth, avoid sonar buoys, guess movement patterns. One wrong maneuver could result in a collision, and it happened more than once. Some encounters were quietly buried by both governments. Others couldn't be hidden. In 1974, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Ivy Bells, a mission so secret it sounded like fiction. Using divers from nuclear submarines, the Americans placed underwater recording devices on Soviet communications cables beneath the Sea of Okhotsk. These devices captured high-level military traffic, including unencrypted messages. The Soviets never imagined anyone could tap an undersea cable in their own backyard. And for nearly a decade, they didn't know. Until someone sold the secret. Ronald Pelton, a former NSA analyst, deeply in debt. The ocean was full of similar missions, classified, dangerous, and often unsanctioned. Submarines weren't just about missiles. They were used for insertion and extraction of spies along coastlines. Underwater drones were deployed to inspect sonar nets, tamper with sensors, or retrieve lost gear. American subs monitored Soviet missile tests from just outside territorial waters, sometimes even entering them, and vice versa. The Soviets had their own underwater games. They deployed so-called black subs that operated in virtual silence. Some Soviet crews were trained for acoustic mimicry, adjusting their engine noise to resemble merchant vessels. The aim? To get close to American coastlines, close to undersea listening posts, close enough to matter. But life aboard these vessels wasn't heroic. Submariners endured claustrophobia, extreme tension, and often literal darkness for months on end. One wrong sound, a dropped wrench, a flushed toilet at the wrong depth, could trigger a sonar alert. Everyone on board lived under the assumption that if a torpedo ever came their way, they'd never hear it in time. And yet, they did it, year after year. Silent, invisible, waiting, not to fire the first shot, but to ensure the other side didn't. Because in the Cold War, it wasn't about winning a battle. It was about preventing one from ever happening. But sometimes, things got too close. An intercepted signal, a submarine caught in the wrong place, a drill mistaken for an attack. Moments when the world stood one misread signal away from ending. And the people watching those signals? They weren't in submarines or even embassies. They were in bunkers. And those bunkers, and the choices made inside them, nearly changed history forever. You're deep underground. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Concrete walls, steel doors, blast-resistant corridors. Phones that don't dial out. Maps on the wall with red pins you're not allowed to touch. Welcome to a Cold War command bunker, where decisions were measured in megatons and every second ticked closer to the end of the world. These weren't just shelters. They were nerve centers. From the USNORAD command center beneath Cheyenne Mountain to the Soviets' deep-level facility outside Moscow known as Perimeter. Because it wasn't the first time the system had flirted with disaster. In 1979, ANORAD training, tape simulating a Soviet missile strike was accidentally loaded into the live system. Screens showed hundreds of incoming warheads. Pilots scrambled. Bombers prepared for launch. It took 6 full minutes before someone double-checked the source and realized it was a drill. Even more chilling was Able Archer 83, a NATO military exercise meant to simulate a transition from conventional warfare to nuclear launch. It was just a game. Because intelligence didn't just win missions. It stopped wars, or started them. And all it took was one mistranslated phrase, one radar echo, one man following orders too literally, or not literally enough. So bunkers like these were filled not with heroes, but with filters. People trained to delay panic, to verify, to doubt. Because doubt in this world was a survival mechanism. Still, the stress left marks: psychological burnout, sleep disorders, nervous breakdowns. Favorite songs. Whispered arguments. One file listed every woman a certain factory worker had smiled at between 1976 and 1984. Some people who read their files discovered that the person informing on them was their best friend or their wife. One man found transcripts of arguments with his teenage daughter, arguments that had never left their living room. In Romania, similar files emerged. In Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. Each time the public reeled. These weren't stories about faraway agents in sunglasses. These were about teachers, bus drivers, co-workers. But the Soviet Union? That was different. Most KGB files were sealed or destroyed before anyone could get to them. A few slipped out. Defectors leaked documents. In the 90s, some journalists got hold of small caches. They revealed secret programs, assassinations, lists of moles embedded in Western governments. But even now, much of the KGB's archive remains locked down, untouched, unknown, And in the West? Files about psychological experiments, mind control research, efforts to develop truth serums and behavior modification techniques. One program, MT Ultra, involved administering LSD to unsuspecting test subjects, including CIA employees, to see if their minds could be rewired. The files admitted that several people suffered lasting psychological damage. Some never recovered. But not everything in the archives was sinister. Some of it was simply absurd. There were memos about exploding cigars meant for Fidel Castro, attempts to weaponize weather balloons, a plan to fake a UFO landing in Cuba to distract the public, Soviet experiments with psychic espionage, training people to see into enemy installations from thousands of miles away. And yet, mixed in with the bizarre, was brilliance. Tech innovations developed for espionage laid the groundwork for modern GPS, fiber optics, even parts of the internet. Surveillance cameras, encryption software, biometric scanners, all have Cold War DNA. But here's the eerie part. Even as the files became public, the names were often redacted. Black bars where identities should have been. Source: Agent 47, Asset Redbird. Because the Cold War might be over on paper, but not everyone has gone home. Some of the agents from that era are still alive, some still active in one way or another, and many of their missions are still classified. Why? Because intelligence is cumulative. It builds on what came before, and secrets, once bought, stolen, or buried, have a strange way of resurfacing. Which is why the end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of espionage. It just meant the players got better at hiding. And some of them, they never stopped playing. Because for certain Cold War operatives, the spy life didn't end when the wall fell. It ended when they did. Once a spy, always a ghost. The skills they'd mastered, not standing out, not revealing too much, never breaking eye contact, unless you wanted to, became habits they couldn't unlearn. Even decades after their last mission, some still checked under their car before starting it, still avoided walking the same route 2 days in a row, still memorized exits without thinking. And some, they were still active. Because while the Cold War officially ended in 1991, the networks it created didn't vanish. The infrastructure, the contacts, the alliances, they just evolved. A handful of retired agents became private contractors, advisors, trainers. Others joined corporate security, where their espionage skills were suddenly worth even more. Some even worked for governments again, quietly returning as gray-haired analysts in glass offices with no nameplates. And some came forward. Over the past few decades, a few Cold War spies from both East and West have gone public. Not just in books, but in courtrooms, documentaries, interviews. They've tried to explain what it was like to live a lie for years on end. Some did it with pride, others with shame, most with exhaustion. One former KGB illegal in Canada gave a rare interview in the 2000s. She described the hardest part of spy life as not knowing if your real self still exists. She had a family under her alias, children who called her mom, and when her cover was blown, she was deported to a country she barely remembered. Her children stayed behind. They had never even known her real name. And then there are the stories that emerge by accident. In 2010, the FBI arrested a group of Russian illegals in the U.S. after years of surveillance. Their neighbors were stunned. These weren't agents in trench coats. They were soccer moms, graphic designers, homeowners. They hosted cookouts, went to PTA meetings, and yet they'd been passing intelligence to Moscow for nearly a decade. And the most chilling part? They weren't anomalies. They were part of an updated version of the Cold War playbook, one that never really got shelved. Today, some of the very people who once ran safe houses and coordinated dead drops now sit on panels about cybersecurity. They write op-eds on information warfare. They get invited to universities to talk about the old days. But they rarely give the full story, because they can't. Some secrets are still sealed, some operations still protected, and some names, even after all these years, still carry weight. That's why so many Cold War operatives simply vanished. Not into witness protection, not into exile, just into the folds of everyday life. You might stand behind one at a post office, share a park bench, ride the same elevator, and never know, because they've been training their entire lives to make sure you don't. But behind that calm exterior, behind the slow voice, the soft handshake, the quiet laugh, is a mind that once juggled ciphers and contingency plans, that once knew how to dismantle a room in 30 seconds and rebuild it with lies. And sometimes, in a quiet moment, they wonder what it was all for, because even they don't always know. And to understand why, you need to go back to the beginning of it all. Before the dossiers, before the embassies, before the betrayals. To the one question no one ever asked enough: why did so many people sign up to be spies in the first place? You're 21 years old, fresh out of university. A quiet stranger approaches you after class. He asks how your German is, mentions your uncle in the Air Force, says you might be useful. And just like that, you're on a list. Many Cold War spies didn't grow up dreaming of espionage. They were recruited, targeted, nudged, and sometimes they didn't even realize it until it was too late. So why did they say yes? For some, it really was patriotism. The Cold War wasn't just geopolitical tension, it was a moral crusade. The West framed it as a fight for freedom. The East saw it as resistance to imperialism. Both sides believed history would judge them as righteous. And when you believe you're saving the world, lies come easier. In the U.S., college campuses were fertile ground for recruitment. Professors passed along promising students, foreign language speakers, math prodigies, curious minds, idealistic kids who wanted to make a difference. The CIA didn't always need soldiers, it needed analysts, codebreakers, linguists. But the approach was gentle. An invitation to a leadership seminar, a research grant, a summer internship. You'd be in the system before you even knew you'd entered the funnel. In the East, it was often more aggressive. The KGB scouted talent young. High test scores, party loyalty, family connections that could land you a place in a special school, followed by a quiet conversation with a man in a gray coat. If you declined, you might be blacklisted from your dream job. If you accepted, you were fast-tracked to the inner sanctum. But ideology wasn't the only motivator. Adventure was a powerful drug. In a world still recovering from World War II, filled with rigid roles and narrow futures, spy work offered a strange kind of freedom. You got to travel, speak other languages, play a character, influence events that moved nations. One American recruit later admitted he joined the CIA because I wanted to be James Bond, minus the martinis. He stayed because the work was addictive. The danger gave life a clarity he couldn't find anywhere else. Some were recruited not because of what they believed, but because of who they knew. Family ties mattered. In both the CIA and KGB, intelligence work often ran in families. If your father was an agent, your name was already on the radar. If your mother had clearance, you were a potential asset. Nepotism wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Trust was everything, and bloodlines were a shortcut. And then there were the true believers, the ideologues, people who crossed lines willingly, even eagerly, to support a cause. Some Americans spied for the Soviets not out of greed, but because they believed capitalism was failing. They saw racism, inequality, poverty, and thought Moscow held the answers. Others in the East spied for the West because they were disillusioned with communism, sick of propaganda, longing for a life where they could say what they felt. There was no single profile. Some were charismatic, others awkward. Some were brilliant, others just well-placed. But they all had one thing in common. They chose. That's what separated spies from soldiers. There were no draft cards, no uniforms, no public parades. Only quiet offers. And quieter agreements. But some never really had a choice. Certain recruits were blackmailed, caught in compromising situations, threatened with exposure, arrest, even harm to their families. They became assets under duress, which made them volatile, dangerous, and often short-lived. Others were tricked, led to believe they were working for a friendly nation, only to realize later they'd been feeding information to the other side. And some, tragically, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught on tape, mentioned in a wiretap, and swept up in a world they didn't understand until they were already drowning. Once you were in, it was hard to get out. Agencies didn't like letting go. Even when you retired, you were monitored, called for debriefs, watched, because once you knew the secrets, you were a liability forever. But there was another, darker motivation for some spies: revenge. People who turned to espionage not for money or principle, but because they felt betrayed, overlooked, abandoned. And when they turned, they burned everything behind them. He was quiet, punctual, wore the same tie every Thursday. No one remembered his laugh until the day he vanished. Then came the reports, the shredded files, the realization. He wasn't working for us. He was working for them. Some of the Cold War's most devastating spies didn't betray their country for money or ideology or love. They did it for revenge. Because espionage wasn't just geopolitical. It was deeply personal. And sometimes, a wounded ego could bring down an entire operation. Take Aldrich Ames. He didn't just walk into a Soviet embassy one day with a list of American assets for sale because he was greedy. He'd been passed over for promotions. He drank too much. He was in debt. And more than anything, he felt invisible, stuck in a system that didn't reward loyalty or effort or even competence. So he sold secrets, dozens of them, for years. Every name he gave up led to someone's capture. Or worse, it was one of the most damaging breaches in CIA history, and it started with a man who just wanted someone to notice him. Or Robert Hansen, the FBI mole who spied for over 2 decades. Hansen was a contradiction, a devout Catholic, a family man, a computer nerd. And yet, he spent his career undermining the very agency he claimed to serve. Why? In his own words, "I get a little lazy and I don't feel I've done enough." He felt unrecognized, underutilized, and when the world failed to meet his expectations, he didn't complain. He leaked. Sometimes revenge wasn't aimed at an agency. Sometimes it was directed at individuals. There are stories, mostly buried in internal memos of operatives who turned after messy divorces. Others who were exposed for affairs and decided to burn everything around them on the way out. One KGB asset in Paris reportedly started leaking to the CIA. His wife left him for a superior officer. His message to Langley was short: "I want him to watch it all fall apart." Even more disturbing were the cases where the revenge was manufactured. Some intelligence services deliberately fostered resentment in targets, sowing seeds of discontent, feeding their doubts, isolating them socially, until defection felt like rebellion. This wasn't recruitment. It was manipulation, and it worked. But revenge wasn't always flashy. Sometimes it was slow, cold, tactical. An analyst gets blamed for a mission failure. His warnings were ignored. Now he's bitter. He sees the same patterns again. Another disaster looming. But this time, instead of flagging it, he leaks it to the enemy. One memo, one shift in strategy, one smug look in a meeting, and a grudge turns into espionage. The agencies knew this, which is why personality profiling became just as important as technical skill. Analysts studied emotional instability, passive aggression, narcissistic tendencies. They needed to know who might break, and not just once, but slowly, quietly, over time. Because the most dangerous spies weren't the dramatic ones. They were the ones who smiled every morning, filed reports on time, and carried the grudge in their pocket like a paperclip. And once they flipped, it didn't stop. Even when they were caught, the damage was already done. The files were already gone. The operations compromised. The trust shattered. Because revenge-driven espionage was a different kind of threat. It wasn't strategic. It was personal. And that made it unpredictable. Ames wasn't a master manipulator. Hansen wasn't a Hollywood villain. They were bureaucrats, with badges, and burned-out hearts. And they weren't alone. Across both sides of the Iron Curtain, agents turned on their own. Missions were leaked. Colleagues exposed. Not to help the other side, but to hurt their own. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it backfired. But each time, the cost wasn't just data. It was trust. And in espionage, that's the first thing you lose, and the last thing you get back. And when trust disappears, what's left? Fear. And at the Cold War's most volatile moments, fear wasn't just an emotion. It was a strategy. You're in a locked room with a phone that doesn't ring unless it's something bad. And today, it's ringing. Not because anything has happened, but because something might. That's the essence of fear as strategy. During the Cold War, it wasn't just about what you knew. It was about what the other side thought you might know. And if you could make them afraid of the wrong thing at the right time, you won. This wasn't paranoia. It was calculated psychological warfare, designed to keep the enemy guessing, doubting, second-guessing their own decisions. The U.S. called it strategic ambiguity. The Soviets had their own term, maskirovka, literally masking. You wouldn't just hide your true plans. You'd create false ones, fake troop movements, plant forged documents, spread whispers through third-party embassies. A tank might be a decoy. A radio signal might be a loop. A defector might be a trap. It was theater, and every performance had consequences. In 1965, the CIA fed fake intelligence to the Soviets, suggesting that American forces would invade Cuba again, not through Miami, but via Panama. The Soviets responded by shifting surveillance assets, weakening their presence elsewhere. Nothing ever happened. That was the point. The goal wasn't to act. It was to distract. But the most potent weapon of all wasn't troop movement or missile threats. It was disinformation. Fake documents, false news stories, leaked accidentally in all the right places. In the 1980s, the KGB ran Operation Infection, a campaign to convince the world that the U.S. had created HIV as a biological weapon. They used fringe newspapers, shell journalists, and forged medical papers. The story gained traction. It took years to fully debunk. And in that time, America lost ground, not militarily, but morally. Because fear wasn't just for soldiers. It was for civilians, too. The idea was to make entire populations uncertain, uneasy, angry at their own governments, suspicious of allies. That kind of public doubt didn't just weaken democracy. It destabilized decision-making. The Soviets leaked stories about CIA-sponsored student protests. The U.S. whispered that top Soviet generals were planning a coup. True? Didn't matter. All that mattered was reaction. Fear was also used internally. Governments made sure their own people were afraid of defecting, afraid of asking questions, afraid of speaking out. You didn't need armed guards at every door. Just the idea that someone was watching, that someone might report you. This created an entire generation of silence. A woman in Prague keeps her curtains drawn for 40 years. A school teacher in Kiev never says her brother's name aloud. A man in Buffalo doesn't to tell his wife he worked for the CIA until their 40th wedding anniversary. Because the Cold War trained people to doubt, not just their enemies, but themselves. That's what made fear so powerful. It lived in the gaps, the things you couldn't prove, the facts that might not be facts. And that kind of fear wasn't just a side effect of espionage. It was espionage. A whispered threat could delay a summit. A doctored photo could end a political career. One intercepted phone call, whether real or not, could justify moving nuclear submarines halfway across the globe. And as the Cold War dragged on, this strategy of fear became so embedded, so normalized, that even high-level operatives forgot where the real line was. They didn't just spy on enemies. They spied on each other. The KGB monitored the GRU. The CIA distrusted the NSA. Allies shared information, and then ran counterintelligence operations on each other just in case. Everyone watched everyone else, and no one felt safe. Not in bunkers. Not in embassies. Not in bed. Because in the Cold War, the threat didn't have to be real. It just had to be possible. And for those who lived through it, agents, assets, analysts, even civilians, that fear never quite went away. Which is why, even today, long after the Cold War ended, traces of it still linger, in headlines, in policy, in how countries talk to each other, but also in one last place. A place we haven't explored yet. You. You're not carrying a briefcase with microfilm. You're not hiding a cyanide pill in your molar. You're not tapping out code on a shortwave radio from a safe house in Vienna. But in a way, you're part of the Cold War, too. Because the legacy of Cold War espionage didn't vanish in 1991. It morphed, quietly, invisibly, and it landed here in everyday life. The habits, the tools, the systems that once belonged to spies now belong to everyone. Surveillance, encryption, psychological manipulation, strategic ambiguity. You live in a world built on Cold War blueprints. You just call them by different names. Think about it. Your phone encrypts your messages. A Cold War breakthrough. Your GPS maps were once military secrets. Your camera lens? That tech was sharpened by spy satellites. Even your social media feed, with its targeted ads and algorithmic suggestions, is the descendant of Cold War psychological operations. The intelligence community didn't retire. It retooled. Instead of recruiting students in parking lots, they track digital footprints. Instead of briefcases, it's cloud storage. Instead of tailing someone on foot, it's metadata. Spycraft never ended. It just scaled. And the mistrust? That, too, remains. The idea that someone might be watching. That the truth has layers. That the version you hear might not be the whole one. All Cold War thinking. Governments still lie. Agencies still play chess. Disinformation still floods channels. The only difference? Now it floods fast. But there's something else. Something harder to see. Harder to shake. A Cold War residue inside the way people think. Ask yourself, why do some countries still hold drills for nuclear strikes? Why do terms like red line or deterrent still shape global policy? Why is intelligence still the most valuable currency in the world? Because fear still works. Because secrets still hold power. Because even in an age of information overload, mystery still matters. That's the paradox. We live in the most connected era in human history. Yet spycraft thrives. In boardrooms. In voting booths. In back channels and signal intercepts. In the whispers between nations that never make the news. And if you've ever read between the lines of a headline, questioned what wasn't said in a press briefing, paused before posting something online because it might be used against you, you rethinking like a Cold War agent without even realizing it. But here's the strange truth. Spies didn't win the Cold War. Not really. Neither did politicians or presidents. Not tanks or treaties or speeches. The Cold War ended, but no one really won. What survived was the architecture, the systems, the assumptions, the idea that power is fragile and loyalty is fluid and that truth is rarely simple. What survived was the lesson that shadows shape history just as much as the spotlight does. And in that sense, every Cold War spy, the ones who vanished, the ones who defected, the ones who never made it home, they left behind something bigger than intelligence. They left behind a world that still moves, to this day, by the rules they lived and died under. The difference now? You're in it. So, what was life really like as a Cold War spy? It was lonely, terrifying, addictive. It was equal parts paperwork and peril, a life lived in fragments, across identities, with truths that were never fully yours to begin with. You woke up every day in a role you couldn't explain to anyone, even yourself. You were a tool, a weapon, a secret, and for what? Some spies believed in the mission. Others just needed the paycheck. Some wanted the thrill. Others had no choice. But no matter how they started, they all ended up the same way, altered. You don't just walk away from that kind of life. You carry it, in muscle memory, in instinct, in the way you scan every room like you're still being followed. What makes Cold War espionage so haunting isn't the gadgets or the missions. It is how ordinary it was, how normal the people were. They shopped, they paid rent, they loved, they lied. The Cold War wasn't fought in trenches. It was fought in hotel lobbies, on payphones, in coded letters dropped behind park benches. And its soldiers weren't tanks or fighter jets. They were people pretending to be someone else, hoping not to get caught. And yet, for all the secrecy, the one thing they couldn't hide was this. The Cold War never really ended. It just changed names. Because espionage isn't a relic of the past. It's a feature of the present. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest trick the Cold War ever pulled wasn't what it hid. It's what it taught us to see. Welcome to the quiet war that never left.